Welcome to our podcast. Today I'm speaking with Paul Trulove, who is Chief Product Officer at SailPoint. Our topic for today is the future of IAM is automated, which is a statement, but which also might be some sort of a question. Welcome, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here and chat about this.
Okay, great. So we had many talks over the past year, so we know each other quite well. And we frequently agree, sometimes we disagree a little, which is, I think, okay. So, but let's start today the conversation with how would you see the state, or how would you describe the state of identity today?
Yeah, I think identity is in a state of change today. In reality, we are bridging from an old world where generally people were, operating in a relatively static environment to a much more dynamic world, particularly on the end systems that we're trying to manage. And so as we are going through that change, identity is also having to change radically from the way that we've approached it over the course of the last decade or so.
Okay, and so I would agree. We see really identity management shifting in, I would say, all areas. So partially driven by what happens in IT. So we see a shift to other types for architectures with microservices, with containers. We see this cloud first strategies. We see the need for a faster time to value of what we do in IT. And I think all of that is affecting all areas we are looking at IT, but it also clearly affects the way identity management looks like. So when you look at why this has been so challenging, what would you say are the biggest challenges of traditional approaches on identity management?
I think historically, identity management projects started from an infrastructure perspective. And so it was, generally an operations team. Some of the newer identity teams just, really came into being over the course of the last several years. And because they were infrastructure projects, they tended to want to boil the ocean, put a big piece of infrastructure in, that required a lot of customization, required really, sometimes months, if not years of design and implementation, before they would turn on the identity management system. And I think we saw this, particularly with some of the legacy provisioning products that, were in place, really in the early 2000s all the way through just the last couple of years. And those lengthy projects make it hard to show value. It also makes it hard to respond to the changing IT environment. And so I think, ultimately, because the projects themselves were long, it made it difficult for people to, maintain consistent funding and all of those kinds of things that are necessary to ultimately grow an identity program, from where it starts to where it ultimately needs to be to add value to the business on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I think there are other things like when you look at how access reviews frequently are done today. So I think I've rarely heard companies which said, okay, access reviews are one of the coolest things we have in place. It's really more the other way around.
Never been said.
Complaining.
That's never been said, right? Yeah. So access reviews are a great example of something that I think, maybe 15 years ago were completely manual. Over the last, decade, organizations that had to do access reviews on a regular basis moved into a semi-automated state where they could use a product like SailPoint to gather the data, create the certification, distribute the certification, but it still required all of the managers or application owners to log in, review the data, complete the certification process. And, if you were only targeting a handful of critical systems, which most organizations, start with, it's maybe not an arduous process. But as you onboard more applications, the scope of the certification can grow so large that ultimately what happens is the users get bogged down and they return to what we were trying to avoid from the beginning, which is rubber stamping. And so they just go through the process so that they can get the checkbox compliance part of it completed and move back to their day job, because nobody wakes up in the morning and says, hey, I want to do access certifications. They wake up and say, I have a real job. Part of that is providing access to the users on my team or the users in the business that I own the application for. And so they do the certification process, but it's not really part of their real business business value.
Paul, both you and I, we know that identity management, on one hand, still has its challenges. That's what we are talking about. But we also know that there has been a huge progress. So when I go back to my early days in identity management, it was very different from what we do today, and a lot of things have really got much better. But so when you look at the trends we see in identity management, which are the trends you see as the most influential to help us sort of stepping or going to the next level of identity management, to improve recertifications, to get processes smoother, to be more agile? So which are the things you see as most influential here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest areas that's changing in identity management today is looking at it through the lens of real business enablement, as opposed to infrastructure for an IT administration team. And one of the reasons is organizations are now fully digitizing their world. And so whether it is the latest cloud application, the cloud infrastructure, business operations systems, marketing systems, all of those things are going online. We're moving away from paper-based models. And so the amount of access required by a user to do their job in the enterprise is significantly greater than what it was 10 years ago. And so I think as organizations begin to realize that, and they realize that identity is at the center of that model, right? The ability to get the right people, the right access at the right time is a critical business function. We're starting to see, a real rotation around the priority of identity. But we're also looking at changing the way that we think about identity from, maybe just implementing it to the high churn systems or compliance relevant systems to it underpins everything that the business does and everything that they are using from an IT management perspective. And that's a pretty significant change from where we've been over the course of the last decade or so.
So it's a lot about really going to take a different perspective. It's from a technical perspective. I think you already brought up this as a service. So getting more into services. I personally believe also that shifting into smaller units, so smaller services which have well-defined APIs, helps us, if you do it right, to better orchestrate, to better change things, because we have a lot of small entities and not a big chunk here to deal with. And I think that is another thing. But there's one other area, which is the entire field of AI and ML, or sometimes we have to put it in big quotas, as we know. So a lot of things are called AI and ML, which aren't that much of AI or ML. But anyway, there's a trend to augment what people can do, to automate, to analyze, to identify anomalies, to provide recommendations. How do you see that impact on the future of identity management and where identity management is evolving?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things. First, people are absolutely looking for solution orientation as opposed to thinking about identity as just infrastructure. And so one of the things that is top of mind is maximizing the value that you get as you turn on the system and begin to use it versus the big bang effect that we've traditionally seen. I think artificial intelligence and machine learning and those technologies are actually giving us the ability to help organizations shift their perspective on identity from one of, a lot of semi-automated processes to true autonomous actions taken by the system. And while AI and machine learning are both buzzwords that a lot of people throw around, the reality is, I think identity in particular is well suited because of the amount of data that's generated in the collection of applications and accounts and entitlements and permissions to running through an AI or ML process in order to help really pattern match in a very different way than a human can do on their own. So we're seeing lots of new opportunities, to not only take certain use cases that have been prevalent in identity, like access certifications or access request and approval processes, and AI enable them by pre-processing information in a way that we can maybe simplify or add additional context to the user as they're interacting. But we're also seeing the opportunity to introduce completely new paradigms because of AI that just changed the way that the enterprise will think about identity. And, a great example would be, really removing the need to do access certifications for a majority of the access out there, because we can let the system evaluate whether access is appropriate based on, the policy model that exists. And if it's appropriate, it should be auto-certified. If it's anomalous or high risk, then we can pop it out and we can ask somebody to participate in an actual certification. And that's a big change and something that I think is going to be incredibly powerful.
And I think that this is where you touched this topic of semi-automation and moving to full automation already. And I think this is another important area because, I'm a strong believer if we grant entitlements based on policies in an automated manner, then we don't need to do a manual recertification of the entitlements that are assigned. We just need to ensure that the policy is correct and that it's working correctly, which is far less work than going through thousands of entitlements, which are then granted via such a policy. So I also would go with you that this is really one area where I feel we can do a lot of things very, very efficiently. And I think this is what it's really about at the end of the day, increasing the efficiency, reducing the workload, and on the other hand, doing things better, doing things right by providing the right recommendations, by doing reviews in an automated manner or avoiding that we need to do reviews, by also identifying anomalies in the assigned entitlements, maybe also at some point in the way entitlements are used. So which all come together. And I think I'm with you. This is really one of the areas where we can help making identity management projects far more successful by applying the right technology, the right manner. So we touched a little bit of trends and what the state is. And I think we're talking about things can get really better. And so you're the Chief Product Officer of SailPoint, and maybe you'd like to touch a little bit on what you're actually doing and what you intend to do soon, so that you can give some more concrete examples, sort of real-world examples of what is already here when looking at your portfolio.
Yeah, so we're very excited about what the next 10 years of identity is going to look like. I think first, identity is becoming a well-recognized part of the IT environment within the enterprise world. So when I first started at SailPoint over 13 years ago, identity was kind of buried in the back of the IT organization. And it's now front and center, because if you can't get people the access that they need, then ultimately you're going to fail on your business objectives. However, one of the things that I think is also true is people don't want to wake up and necessarily have to think about identity management day to day. And so, when SailPoint got started, early days, we definitely had a lot of these ideas in mind, but the technology wasn't available to implement some of the automation, the way in which, the new AI frameworks and the big data frameworks allow us to implement them today. And so, over the course of the past several years, we've been hard at work at not only looking at our existing, products and determining new ways that we can simplify identity management, both from a deployment perspective, but also day-to-day usage perspective. We're looking at ways that we completely change the identity management paradigms that we're used to. And a couple of great examples, in our products today, we actually use AI to generate recommendations on whether somebody should accept access or reject access in the context of a certification or an approval. We can take that recommendation, we can use it to actually automate the entire certification process for entitlements where the system has confidence that it knows the right decision to make. We're also looking at ways, you brought up the policy example a minute ago, and I think policy, regardless of how you define it exactly, is going to be a critical way that we ultimately get to the self-driving state for identity, where we can define what's right and what's wrong, and the system can actually be in charge of bringing those two worlds into alignment. And I think if you look at traditional role management projects as an example of setting access policy, they were fraught with challenges because organizations would spend years trying to define the perfect role model. They might spend months implementing it in a tool like SailPoint, but the day that they turn it on, the business changes, they add new applications, they decommission applications, and all of a sudden the role or policy model, is now broken. What we want to be able to do is move that into a continuous state of analysis so that, we don't do big bang role management projects or role mining, as part of that. We actually let the system continuously look at the information and pop out recommendations on ways to evolve the policy that's assigning access and improve that policy so that, more access can be automated when people are onboarded or move within the organization. Certifications can be automated from the perspective of signing off on existing access and making recommendations on where maybe deprovisioning is appropriate for extraneous entitlements. We also want to look at how we bring activity information, right? Usage data about what users are actually doing with their access, and use that to improve, the assignment models that we're using. Use that to actually reduce the amount of access that is actually provisioned in the environment, which ultimately allows us to reduce the threat aperture that's out there for the bad guys.
Yeah, that sounds interesting, and I think this is well aligned with also what we are seeing. So going to more flexible deployment models, more flexible architectures, but really making use of technology to reduce the manual work, which can be well automated. There are a lot of things which can be automated, which can be done better. So I think we are really seeing the next wave, the next shift. And I would agree with what you state. The future of IAM is really automated. The less manual work, the better it is. With that, I think we're already at the end of our talk. Paul, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you very much for all the insight you've provided. Goodbye.
Appreciate it, Martin. It was a great conversation. Thank you.